Vanessa Crawford believed she was protecting the comfort of an important VIP that morning. But within 10 minutes, she would discover that the quiet woman she was about to humiliate held enough power to change the future of the entire airline, and the memory of that mistake would haunt her long after the aircraft touched down. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The departure terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and conversations drifting beneath bright ceiling lights. Travelers hurried through the gate area while airline staff moved with practiced efficiency. Among the crowd sat Claire Whitaker, a 39-year-old woman dressed in dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple gray sweater. Nothing about her appearance attracted attention. No designer handbag, no jewelry beyond a modest watch, no entourage. She sat quietly near the boarding gate, reading messages on her phone while other passengers walked past without giving her a second glance. That was exactly how Claire preferred it. Across the terminal, however, attention was gathering around another name. Senator Richard Hale had been booked on the same flight to Chicago. Airport employees whispered about his arrival. Ground staff double-checked details. A few passengers eagerly hoped to catch a glimpse of the famous politician. The atmosphere shifted whenever someone important was expected, and few people understood that better than Vanessa Crawford. As the senior flight attendant assigned to the premium cabin, Vanessa took pride in maintaining what she called standards. At 42, she carried herself with polished confidence, her navy uniform perfectly pressed, her posture flawless. She believed first impressions revealed everything necessary about a person. Wealth looked a certain way. Importance dressed a certain way. Status announced itself before a word was spoken. At least, that was what Vanessa had convinced herself. Boarding began promptly at 8:15 a.m. Passengers formed lines as agents scanned tickets. Claire quietly joined the priority boarding group and stepped onto the aircraft. The spacious business-class cabin glowed under soft lighting. Leather seats stretched across the front section of the plane. Claire found her assigned seat, settled comfortably beside the window, and gazed out at the busy runway. Several passengers nearby glanced at her boarding pass, then at her clothes. Their expressions carried subtle confusion. One businessman raised an eyebrow. Another passenger exchanged a knowing look with his wife. Nobody said anything, but the judgment was there. Vanessa noticed it too. As she welcomed passengers aboard, her eyes paused on Claire for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the casually dressed woman sitting in one of the most expensive seats on the aircraft bothered her. She checked the manifest once, then checked it again. The seat number was correct, yet suspicion lingered. 10 minutes later, movement near the cabin entrance caught her attention. A gate supervisor approached quickly and leaned close enough to speak in a low voice. Vanessa listened carefully. Her expression immediately changed. Then she glanced toward Claire's seat. A slow smile appeared. Straightening her uniform jacket, Vanessa walked directly toward the window seat and stopped beside Claire. The surrounding passengers fell quiet as Vanessa politely folded her hands and said, "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a situation with your seat assignment. I'm going to need you to come with me." Claire looked up calmly from her seat and met Vanessa Crawford's confident smile without the slightest sign of panic. Around them, the business-class cabin seemed to shrink as nearby passengers quietly turned their attention toward the unfolding exchange. The engines hummed softly outside while the final groups of travelers continued boarding, completely unaware that a very different kind of turbulence was beginning inside the aircraft. "I believe there must be some mistake," Claire said politely. "This is the seat listed on my boarding pass." Vanessa maintained her professional expression, but the slight tightening around her eyes revealed irritation. She had expected immediate compliance. Instead, she found herself facing a woman who remained calm despite being singled out in front of dozens of strangers. "I understand your concern, ma'am," Vanessa replied. "However, we need to make an accommodation for an important passenger. I am asking you to gather your belongings and come with me." Claire glanced briefly at her boarding pass and then back at Vanessa. "With respect, I purchased this seat. I arrived on time, boarded properly, and followed every instruction. Why exactly am I being asked to move? The question was reasonable. That was precisely what made Vanessa uncomfortable. A few passengers exchanged looks. One man seated across the aisle folded his newspaper and began listening openly. Another passenger quietly removed an earbud. The cabin atmosphere was changing. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. Certain situations require flexibility. Claire remained composed. I am happy to be flexible when there is an emergency. Is there an emergency? For a brief moment, Vanessa had no answer. The silence lingered just long enough to attract even more attention. Then she straightened her posture. The matter involves a distinguished guest of the airline. Claire nodded slowly. And that gives someone the right to take a seat that belongs to another paying passenger? Several passengers looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. The question hung in the air. A young flight attendant named Emily Foster stood several rows away, organizing carry-on luggage. She had witnessed the entire conversation from the beginning. Unlike Vanessa, Emily noticed something unusual about Claire. There was no anger in her voice. No arrogance. No attempt to cause a scene. She simply seemed to be asking for fair treatment. Emily felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something about the situation did not feel right. Yet Vanessa was the senior crew member. Speaking up against her could create problems Emily was not prepared to face. Meanwhile, a businessman seated nearby leaned toward his companion and whispered loudly enough to be heard. If they are asking her to move, there is probably a reason. His companion glanced at Claire's simple clothes and nodded. Exactly. Airlines do not do that without cause. The assumptions spread quietly through the cabin. Claire heard every word. She had experienced similar moments before. People often mistook simplicity for insignificance. What they never understood was that genuine confidence rarely needed an audience. Vanessa sensed the growing support from nearby passengers and became bolder. Ma'am, I am trying to resolve this discreetly. Claire folded her hands calmly in her lap. Then perhaps you can explain why I am being treated differently from everyone else. Vanessa's smile vanished. The challenge to her authority, however polite, felt increasingly personal. Behind her, Emily watched with growing concern. She noticed that several passengers were now openly staring. The entire cabin seemed suspended in anticipation. Then Vanessa made a decision. It was the kind of decision people often make when pride becomes more important than fairness. She stepped back, raised her voice just enough for the surrounding rows to hear, and said, "Very well. Since there seems to be confusion, I will need to verify your eligibility for this seat. May I see proof that you qualify to occupy this section of the aircraft?" The cabin fell completely silent. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence inside the business class cabin felt heavier than the aircraft itself. Claire Whitaker remained seated by the window, her expression calm, while Vanessa Crawford stood over her with growing confidence. Around them, curious faces watched from nearly every direction. What had started as a private disagreement had become a public spectacle. Claire slowly looked up. "Eligibility?" she asked. "I purchased the ticket through the airline's official system. What additional qualification would I need?" Vanessa folded her arms. Certain premium accommodations are intended for a specific level of traveler. The words immediately drew attention. Several passengers nodded as though they understood exactly what she meant. One man seated near the front chuckled quietly. "This should not take long," he muttered. Another passenger added, "If she belongs here, she can prove it." Claire heard every comment. She also noticed something else. Emily Foster, the younger flight attendant, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Emily shifted her weight and glanced toward Vanessa, as if considering whether to intervene. But each time she opened her mouth, she stopped herself. Senior crew members controlled performance reviews. Challenging Vanessa publicly could have consequences. Meanwhile, boarding continued. More passengers entered the cabin and sensed immediately that something unusual was happening. Conversations quieted. Eyes drifted toward Claire. The pressure grew with every passing second. Vanessa extended her hand. "Your documentation, please." Claire calmly retrieved a slim leather travel wallet from her bag. Inside were her identification, boarding pass, and several business cards. As she opened it, one card partially slipped free and landed briefly on the armrest before she picked it up again. Emily caught a glimpse of the card. Only a glimpse. But she distinctly saw the silver outline of an aircraft and the word Whitaker printed across the top. Something about it triggered recognition. Emily had seen that name somewhere before. Before she could think further, the card disappeared back into the wallet. Claire handed over her boarding pass. Vanessa examined it carefully. Her expression tightened. Everything appeared valid. The seat assignment was correct. The boarding group was correct. There was no violation. No mistake. Nothing that justified removing Claire from the seat. Yet admitting that now would mean losing authority in front of the entire cabin. Vanessa was unwilling to do that. Interesting, she said. But a boarding pass only tells part of the story. Several nearby passengers nodded approvingly. One woman whispered loudly, "Exactly." Claire tilted her head slightly. I was not aware that airline policy included appearance-based requirements. A few passengers looked away. Others frowned. The remark landed harder than anyone expected. Emily felt her stomach sink. Claire was making sense. Too much sense. Yet the crowd had already chosen a side. Vanessa sensed that if she backed down now, she would look foolish. Her pride pushed her forward. At that exact moment, Senator Richard Hale entered the business class cabin accompanied by a gate representative. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Passengers smiled. Heads turned. Vanessa's face brightened. There was her justification. There was the reason she had been waiting for. She hurried toward the senator, greeting him warmly before gesturing toward Claire's row. The senator looked briefly confused, but Vanessa barely gave him time to respond. Turning back toward the cabin, she raised her voice so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We simply need to resolve a seating matter involving one of our distinguished guests." The cabin grew completely silent. Claire remained seated. Emily's heart raced. And Vanessa, convinced she was about to prove her point once and for all, took a deep breath and prepared to publicly ask Claire to surrender her seat in front of the entire business class cabin. Senator Richard Hale looked from Vanessa Crawford to Claire Whitaker, clearly sensing that he had stepped into a situation already far more complicated than anyone had explained. Yet before he could speak, Vanessa moved forward with the confidence of someone convinced she was protecting the airline's reputation. "Ma'am," she announced, her voice carrying through the business class cabin, "this seat is needed for a distinguished guest. I am formally requesting that you relocate to another section of the aircraft." The words landed like a stone in still water. Every nearby passenger heard them. Several leaned forward. Others exchanged knowing glances. Claire remained seated for a moment, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The sunlight pouring through the window illuminated her reflection against the glass. She looked neither angry nor embarrassed. She simply looked disappointed. Vanessa interpreted the silence as resistance. "I am trying to avoid making this more difficult than necessary," she continued. "Please gather your belongings." A businessman across the aisle shook his head. "Some people just do not know when to let things go," he muttered. A few passengers nodded in agreement. The pressure inside the cabin intensified. Claire slowly stood. The movement seemed to satisfy several observers immediately. Vanessa felt a small sense of victory. In her mind, the situation was finally being resolved. Emily Foster, however, felt no relief. The younger flight attendant watched Claire rise from her seat with remarkable composure. There was no bitterness in her expression, no attempt to embarrass anyone, no dramatic protest. Somehow that made the scene even harder to witness. Claire reached for her carry-on bag and paused. Then she turned toward Vanessa. The cabin became strangely quiet. Even passengers who had supported Vanessa seemed curious about what Claire would say. Claire's voice was calm and measured. "You know," she said softly, "I have spent most of my life sitting in rooms where people assumed they knew my value before I ever spoke." Nobody interrupted. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they were right. But the one lesson I learned is that respect should never depend on titles, clothing, or who happens to be watching. A hush settled over the cabin. Several passengers lowered their eyes. Even Senator Hale appeared thoughtful. Claire continued, "A seat can be reassigned. A ticket can be replaced. But the way we choose to treat people says far more about us than it does about them." For the first time since the confrontation began, Vanessa felt a flicker of uncertainty. The words were not aggressive. They were not accusatory. They simply carried the weight of quiet truth. The silence stretched for several seconds. Nobody seemed eager to break it. Then Vanessa forced a professional smile back onto her face. Pride would not allow her to retreat now. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said briskly. "Please follow me." Claire gave a small nod. Without another word, She lifted her bag from the overhead compartment. As she did, her phone briefly illuminated in her hand. Emily happened to glance at the screen. A notification banner appeared for less than a second before disappearing. She could not read the entire message, but one phrase stood out clearly. Board meeting confirmed. Whitaker Aerospace. Emily's eyes widened. Before she could process what she had seen, Claire slipped the phone into her pocket. Then she calmly stepped into the aisle. The passengers watched as she prepared to leave the seat she had legally purchased. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The engines vibrated softly beneath the floor. Claire stood alone in the center of the silent cabin, carrying her bag with quiet dignity, while Vanessa gestured toward the rear of the aircraft, completely unaware that the decision she had just enforced was about to change everything. Claire Whitaker followed the direction Vanessa Crawford indicated, carrying her bag through the business-class cabin with the same calm dignity she had shown from the beginning. The eyes of strangers followed her every step. Some looked satisfied. Others looked uncomfortable. A few simply looked away. The aircraft seemed quieter now, as though even the steady hum of the ventilation system had softened in response to what had just happened. Claire reached an empty seat near the dividing curtain between cabins and gently placed her bag beside her. She could have argued. She could have demanded a supervisor. She could have forced the airline to follow its own policies. Instead, she sat down and gazed through the small oval window. Beyond the glass, baggage vehicles moved across the tarmac beneath the bright Texas morning sun. For a moment, her expression softened. Today was not just another business trip. It marked exactly 10 years since the day Whitaker Aerospace had launched its first aircraft navigation platform from a tiny rented warehouse outside Denver. Claire remembered standing beside her late father in that warehouse, surrounded by folding tables, borrowed equipment, and impossible dreams. Most investors had laughed at them. Some had called the project unrealistic. Others had dismissed them because neither of them came from the elite circles that usually controlled the industry. Her father had never forgotten those moments. Neither had Claire. Before he passed away, he had given her one piece of advice that shaped every decision she made afterward. He had said, "The easiest thing in the world is to treat important people well. The real test of character is how you treat people when you think they cannot do anything for you." The memory remained as clear as the day he spoke those words. That was why this moment mattered. Not because of the seat, not because of the embarrassment, but because it revealed something deeper about the culture she encountered far too often. A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am." Claire looked up to find Emily Foster standing nearby. The young flight attendant appeared nervous. She glanced over her shoulder before speaking again. "I just wanted to say, I am sorry." Claire offered a small smile. "For what?" Emily hesitated. "For how everything happened." Claire studied her for a moment. Unlike the others, Emily seemed genuinely troubled. "You do not owe me an apology," Claire said gently. "You were not the one making decisions." Emily lowered her eyes. "Maybe not. But sometimes watching something unfair happen and staying silent feels almost the same." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "Then learn from it. That feeling exists for a reason. Most people ignore it. The people who change the world usually do not." Emily looked surprised by the kindness in her response. After everything that had happened, she had expected frustration. Instead, she found grace. The words stayed with her. As Emily stepped away, Claire reached into her bag and opened her laptop. The screen illuminated instantly. Several messages had already arrived from executives waiting in Chicago. She calmly typed a short response and closed the computer again. A few rows away, Vanessa laughed quietly with another crew member, completely unaware of what was unfolding. Then, without warning, the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted. A sharp notification tone sounded from the intercom panel near the front galley. Another followed immediately after it. Crew members exchanged puzzled looks. Then a third alert appeared. The color drained from one flight attendant's face as she stared at the incoming message. And for the first time that morning, Vanessa Crawford stopped smiling. The notification tones continued echoing through the front galley, each one arriving faster than the last. Flight attendants who had been chatting moments earlier suddenly focused on their tablets. Expressions shifted from casual curiosity to visible concern. Vanessa Crawford watched one of the crew members scroll through a message, then read it again as though hoping the words would change. "What is going on?" Vanessa asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Near the front of the aircraft, the lead gate supervisor hurried back through the boarding door, carrying a headset. His pace alone was enough to draw attention. Airline employees rarely moved that quickly unless something significant had happened. Passengers noticed it too. Conversations faded. Several people turned toward the front galley. Even Senator Richard Hale lowered the newspaper he had been reading. The atmosphere inside the cabin felt different now. Sharper. More focused. Emily Foster looked down at her own device and felt her pulse quicken. A priority communication had appeared across the screen. The message came from corporate headquarters. Not local operations. Not customer service. Headquarters. That alone was unusual. Then she saw the names attached to the chain. Senior executives. Legal counsel. The office of the chief executive officer. Emily looked across the cabin toward Claire Whitaker, who remained seated calmly near the divider curtain. Claire appeared completely unbothered. She sat with her hands folded, watching the activity unfold with the same quiet composure she had maintained all morning. That calmness suddenly seemed far more significant than before. A moment later, the boarding door reopened. The gate's supervisor returned accompanied by a man in a dark suit carrying an airport credentials badge. Several crew members recognized him immediately. He was not part of the flight crew. He was a senior regional operations director for Skylux Airlines. People at his level rarely appeared at gates without advance notice. The man stepped aboard and spoke briefly with the captain near the cockpit entrance. Whatever he said caused the captain's expression to change instantly. The two exchanged a quick look before both turned toward the passenger cabin. Vanessa felt a knot forming in her stomach. For the first time that morning, uncertainty began replacing confidence. This cannot be related to that passenger, she thought. Yet the possibility had already entered her mind. The captain walked down the aisle with measured steps. The cabin fell silent. Passengers who had been observing the situation since the beginning now watched openly. No one pretended otherwise. The regional director followed closely behind him. When they reached Claire's row, both men stopped. The captain offered a respectful nod. Not the polite nod given to customers. Something different. Something closer to professional respect. Vanessa felt her chest tighten. Emily noticed it too. Senator Hale slowly lowered his newspaper completely. Claire rose from her seat. The regional director extended his hand. "Ms. Whitaker," he said carefully. "Thank you for your patience." The words seemed to remove all remaining air from the cabin. Vanessa froze. The name struck her immediately. Whitaker. Suddenly the business card. The notification. The corporate messages. Everything connected at once. Her face lost color. Around her, crew members exchanged stunned looks. Claire accepted the handshake politely. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply waited. The captain glanced toward Vanessa before turning back to Claire. Then, in a voice calm enough to be polite, yet firm enough to stop every heartbeat in the cabin, he said, "Ms. Whitaker, corporate headquarters has instructed us to inform you that the acquisition agreement was finalized 15 minutes ago." The words settled over the cabin like a sudden change in air pressure. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The acquisition agreement. Finalized. 15 minutes ago. Vanessa Crawford stared at Claire Whitaker as though she were looking at a completely different person. The confident passenger she had dismissed only moments earlier now stood at the center of a reality she could barely comprehend. The regional director cleared his throat. As of this morning, Whitaker Aerospace has become the majority owner of Skylux Airlines. A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. The businessman who had mocked Claire earlier slowly lowered his gaze. The woman who had questioned whether she belonged in business class suddenly seemed fascinated by the floor. Even Senator Richard Hale looked genuinely impressed. "Whitaker Aerospace," he repeated quietly. "The same company leading the National Aviation Modernization Program?" The regional director nodded. "Yes, Senator." A hush followed. Claire remained calm. She showed no sign of satisfaction, no sign of triumph. She simply listened. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily Foster finally stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly, yet her voice remained steady. Everything she said was true, Emily said. Her ticket was valid. Her seat assignment was correct. She never raised her voice. She never caused a problem. The honesty of the statement seemed to strike the cabin harder than the acquisition announcement itself, because everyone had witnessed it. They had seen the same events unfold. They had simply chosen different conclusions. The captain looked toward Claire. Ms. Whitaker, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize. Several crew members nodded immediately. Vanessa remained frozen. Claire looked around the cabin. Dozens of eyes now watched her with a completely different expression. Minutes earlier they had seen an ordinary passenger. Now they saw influence, success, and power. Yet Claire noticed something troubling about the transformation. The respect had arrived only after the title, only after the wealth, only after the revelation. That was the real problem. Thank you, she said softly. But I do not think this is about an apology. The cabin became silent again. Claire continued. What happened today was never about a seat. Her voice carried naturally through the quiet aircraft. The seat was simply the excuse. Nobody interrupted. People reveal their values when they believe there is nothing to gain from being kind. Vanessa felt each word land with painful clarity. Claire turned slightly toward the crew. The truth is, I did not buy this airline because of profits. Several passengers looked surprised. The regional director smiled faintly, as though he already knew the story. Claire continued. 10 years ago, my father and I started our company because we believed aviation could connect opportunities to people who would otherwise never receive them. Over the past decade, Whitaker Aerospace has funded pilot scholarships, engineering programs, and employee education initiatives across the country. Some of those programs even supported Skylux employees. Emily blinked in surprise. She suddenly remembered the scholarship that had helped pay for her aviation certification 2 years earlier. The scholarship funded anonymously through a foundation connected to Whitaker Aerospace. The realization hit her instantly. Claire had been creating opportunities for people she had never met. Quietly, without publicity, without recognition. Around the cabin, the atmosphere shifted once more. This time it was not fear. It was respect. Genuine respect. The kind that could not be purchased by a title or demanded through authority. As Claire returned to her seat, the same passengers who had once doubted her now watched with admiration. And for the first time that morning, nobody saw a casually dressed traveler. They saw the woman who had quietly been lifting others long before anyone knew her name. The cabin remained quiet long after Claire Whitaker returned to her seat. The tension that had filled the aircraft earlier had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something entirely different. Passengers who had once watched with judgment now watched with respect. Crew members who had followed assumptions now seemed eager to reconsider them. Near the front galley, the captain and regional director spoke privately for several minutes before approaching Claire once more. Ms. Whitaker, the regional director said carefully, corporate leadership would like to know how you wish us to proceed regarding this incident. Several crew members immediately looked toward Vanessa Crawford. She stood motionless, her posture no longer confident. For the first time all morning, she seemed unsure of what would happen next. Many people expected Claire to demand consequences. Some expected termination. Others expected public criticism. After all, she now possessed both the authority and influence to make such decisions. Instead, Claire surprised everyone. I do not believe people improve through humiliation, she said. We have already had enough of that today. The words settled over the cabin. Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes. Claire continued. The issue is not one employee. The issue is a culture that encourages people to judge value based on appearances. If we want improvement, then we fix the system that allowed the mistake to happen. The captain nodded thoughtfully. The regional director listened carefully. Claire spoke with the calm confidence of someone focused on solutions rather than revenge. I want every customer-facing employee to receive additional training centered on dignity, fairness, and unbiased service. I also want a review of any policies that allow subjective assumptions to influence passenger treatment. The regional director immediately made notes. Consider it done. Then Claire glanced toward Emily Foster. The young flight attendant looked startled when she realized Claire was looking directly at her. There is one more thing, Claire said. People who demonstrate integrity should be encouraged. Emily shifted nervously. Claire smiled. Emily spoke honestly when it would have been easier to stay silent. Airlines do not succeed because of airplanes. They succeed because of people like that. Emily felt her face flush. Several crew members nodded in agreement. Even the captain smiled. For the first time all morning, genuine warmth returned to the cabin. Around them, passengers who had witnessed everything began viewing the situation through a different lens. The businessman who had criticized Claire earlier quietly approached her seat. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I made assumptions I should not have made." Claire accepted it graciously. Others followed, not because they feared her power, but because they recognized their own mistakes reflected in what had happened. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained near the galley. She listened to every conversation, every apology, every expression of admiration. Yet none of it hurt as much as Claire's refusal to retaliate. Punishment would have been easier to process. Kindness forced reflection. Eventually, Vanessa walked forward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I am sorry, Ms. Whitaker." Claire looked at her calmly. "Thank you." Nothing more was needed. No lecture. No public condemnation. No dramatic confrontation. Vanessa lowered her eyes. In that moment, she finally understood what had happened. She had spent years believing that status could be identified by clothing, confidence, or appearance. Yet the most powerful person on the aircraft had also been the most humble. And as the engines outside grew louder and preparations for departure resumed, Vanessa realized the deepest lesson of all. The person she had considered least important had been the one teaching everyone else what respect truly looked like. By the time the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed completely. The same passengers who had once watched Claire Whitaker with suspicion now greeted her with quiet respect. The judgment had vanished. In its place remained something far more valuable: understanding. As the plane climbed above the clouds, sunlight spilled across the cabin windows, bathing everything in a warm golden glow. Claire leaned back in her seat and looked out across the endless horizon. For the first time that morning, she felt at peace. The day had never been about proving who she was. It had never been about titles, ownership, or business deals. It had been about honoring the lesson her father had taught her so many years ago, a lesson she had carried through every success, every setback, and every milestone along the way. Several hours later, the aircraft landed smoothly in Chicago. As passengers prepared to disembark, Vanessa Crawford approached Claire one final time. Gone was the confidence that had once been fueled by assumptions. Gone was the certainty that appearances revealed a person's worth. She stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Whitaker, I owe you a real apology." Claire looked up calmly. Vanessa continued. "What happened today was my responsibility. I made judgments I had no right to make. I embarrassed someone who had done nothing wrong. I cannot change what happened, but I can learn from it." Her voice carried none of the defensiveness that often accompanies regret. There were no excuses, no attempts to shift blame, only honesty. Claire nodded gently. "That is all any of us can do." Vanessa lowered her eyes. "Thank you for showing more grace than I deserve." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Claire extended her hand. Vanessa accepted it. The gesture was simple, but it carried more meaning than any punishment ever could. Nearby, Emily Foster watched the exchange unfold. She still looked overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Just before leaving the aircraft, the regional director approached her with a smile. "Emily, corporate would like to speak with you next week regarding a leadership development program." Emily blinked in surprise. "Me? You demonstrated integrity under pressure," he replied. "That matters." Tears briefly filled her eyes, though she quickly smiled through them. Across the cabin, Senator Richard Hale paused before exiting. He shook Claire's hand and thanked her for the work Whitaker Aerospace had done to expand educational opportunities throughout the aviation industry. Other passengers followed with similar words. Some offered apologies. Others offered admiration. Claire accepted each one with humility. Later that evening, she stood in a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Around her sat executives, engineers, and employees whose futures had been shaped by the agreement finalized earlier that day. Yet before discussing numbers or strategy, Claire quietly placed a framed photograph on the table. It showed a small warehouse in Denver and a smiling man standing beside a much younger version of herself. Her father. The room grew silent. Claire smiled softly. The promise she had made to him had been fulfilled. Not through wealth, not through power, but through the values he had taught her to protect. And that night, everyone remembered that dignity does not become valuable when power recognizes it. It was valuable all along.